Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Missing Heirloom. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ali, and I'm delighted that you've joined us. May I ask, what is it about these cozy mysteries that you find so comforting? Share in the comments, and please subscribe so our community can continue to grow. Let us begin the story. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Wickham Manor. The note had arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped beneath Miss Marple's door by the postman with an apologetico that suggested he knew its contents were rather grander than the usual village correspondence. Miss Marple had been sitting by her window with her knitting, observing Mrs. Binns from the grocer's shop, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with the vicar's wife about the arrangement of flowers for Sunday service. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, expressed itself so clearly in the smallest of disputes. The envelope was of heavy cream stock, the sort that whispered of old money and older traditions. Inside, the handwriting was firm, but slightly tremulous. Greater than dear Miss Marple, I find myself in need of your particular wisdom in a matter both delicate and distressing. Would you be so kind as to take tea with me tomorrow, greater than at 3 o'clock? I should be most grateful. Greater than yours, sincerely. Greater than Beatrice Wickham. Miss Marple set down her knitting needles with care. Lady Wickham. She had met the woman perhaps 3 times. Over the years at her garden parties and charitable functions where Lady Wickham had moved through the crowds with the assured grace of one who knew her position and expected others to acknowledge it. Not unkind, Miss Marple thought, but certainly proud, very proud, indeed rather like Mrs. Targreave's frammed village, who had worn the same pearl necklace to every occasion for 30 years. Even after her husband's investments had failed, and the pearls had been quietly replaced with paste. The following afternoon found Miss Marple stepping down from the village taxi at the gates of Wickham Manor. The house rose before her, Georgian and graceful, its honey-coloured stone glowing in the autumn sunlight. The gardens, she noted, were immaculately maintained, though perhaps a touch too formal for her taste. Everything in its proper place, every hedge trimmed to precision. It spoke of control, of standards rigidly upheld. The butler who answered the door was a man of perhaps 50, with carefully neutral expression of one trained to see everything and reveal nothing. His name, he informed her, was Graves, and he would show her to the drawing-room where Lady Wickham awaited as they passed through the entrance hall. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in the signs of genteel strain that always told their own story. The portraits on the walls were magnificent, but the wallpaper beneath them had faded in places where other pictures must once have hung. The Turkish carpet was genuine and beautiful, but worn thin along one edge. Money, she thought, was perhaps not as abundant as the house's exterior suggested. The drawing-room was elegant, dominated by tall windows that overlooked the south lawn. Lady Wickham rose from a wing chair near the fireplace, and Miss Marple was struck by how much she had aged since their last meeting. She was a tall woman, still with the ramrod posture of her generation, but her face had grown thinner, more drawn. Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, trembled slightly as she extended one in greeting. Miss Marple, how good of you to come. Please do sit down. Graves, tea, if you please. As the butler withdrew with a slight bow, Lady Wickham settled herself once more, arranging her skirts with a precision that seemed almost defensive. For a long moment she said nothing, and Miss Marple waited with the patience of one who knew that words, like cream, rose best when left undisturbed. You must think it odd, Lady Wickham began, at last, my summoning you here. We are not, After all, intimately. Not at all, Miss Marple replied gently, though I confess some curiosity. Lady Wickham's mouth tightened. I find myself in a most distressing situation, a matter requiring discretion, and dare I say it, someone with an understanding of human nature in its less admirable aspects. Before Miss Marple could respond, the door opened to admit not the butler but a younger woman, fair-haired and pretty in the fragile way of girls who have recently been weeping. She stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple. Grandmother, I did not know you had a visitor. I beg your pardon. This is my granddaughter, Sylvia, Lady Wickham said, her voice softening fractionally. Sylvia, this is Miss Marple from the village. The girl managed a wan smile. Her eyes, Miss Marple noted, were red-rimmed, and there was a tension in hers holders that spoke of sleepless nights. She was dressed simply but elegantly, and she wore no jewellery, save for a rather modern engagement ring that seemed somehow at odds with the house's stately traditionalism. I am pleased to meet you, Miss Marple. I fear we are not receiving visitors under the happiest of circumstances. Sylvia, please, Lady Wickham said sharply. There is no need to burden Miss Marple with our troubles immediately upon her arrival. But the damage had been done. The girl's face crumpled slightly, and she excused herself with a murmur about checking on the arrangements for dinner, fleeing Fareham with the particular haste of one barely maintaining composure. Lady Wickham watched her go with an expression that mingled love and exasperation in equal measure. She has been through a great deal these past 2 days. We all have. Graves returned then with the tea tray, and the ritual of pouring and serving provided a brief respite. Miss Marple accepted her cup and waited. She had learned long ago that silence was often the most effective of all questions. The Wickham emerald has been stolen, Lady Wickham said at last, the words emerging as though forced. It vanished from my dressing table sometime during Wednesday night. The box was locked. The key never left my maid's possession, and yet by morning it was gone. Miss Marple set down her cup with care. How very distressing. Have the police been notified? The constable has been informed. Yes, a well-meaning man, but I fear quite out of his depth. Lady Wickham's hands tightened on her own cup. The brooch has been in my family for 5 generations, Miss Marple. It is worth a considerable sum, but its sentimental value is beyond calculation. The timing could not be worse. Sylvia's engagement is to be announced formally in 2 days' time at a party we've been planning for months. I see. And you believe the thief is someone within the household? Lady Wickham's face hardened. Who else could it be? The servants? She paused, then added bitterly, one trusts them with one's home, one's very safety, and yet she did not finish the sentence. But Miss Marple understood well enough. Trust betrayed was a wound that cut deeper than theft alone. Rather like young Emily Hartnell, Miss Marple mused, who blamed the new parlour-maid for the disappearance of a silver spoon, only to discover weeks later that her own nephew had pawned it for gambling debts. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested delicately, you might tell me exactly what occurred on Wednesday evening. Lady Wickham drew a breath, composing herself. I had several guests, Ferdinand, nothing elaborate, merely old friends, the vicar and his wife, Dr. Haydock, and of course, Sylvia's fiancé, Mr. Raymond Hale. After dinner, I showed them the brooch. I often do so when I have company, as it is quite the finest piece in the collection. Her voice held a note of pride that even distress could not entirely suppress. At 10 o'clock, I retired to my room. My maid, Clara, placed the brooch in its case and locked it in the drawer of my dressing table. The key remains, always in a chain about her neck, and in the morning the drawer was still locked, but when Clara opened it, the case was empty. Lady Wickham's voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper. Someone. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Brooch. Lady Wickham, as account of her household, was delivered with the precision of one accustomed to cataloguing possessions. There was Graves, the butler, who had been with the family for 23 years, Mrs. Hotchkiss, the cook, with 15 years of service, Clara, the lady's maid, a mere 7 years, though Lady Wickham pronounced this with the air of one conferring considal tenure. Then there was Andrew, the young footman, not quite 2 years in his position, and old Jennings, the gardener, who had tended the grounds since Lady Wickham's own marriage 40 years prior. Miss Marple listened with the attentiveness of one hearing not merely a list of names, but a map of relationships, dependencies, and possible resentments. In her experience, households were rather like villages, with the same hierarchies and jealousies operating beneath a veneer of civility. And your granddaughter's fiancé? Miss Marple ventured. Mr. Hale he was present at dinner. A slight tightening around Lady Wickham's mouth told its own story. Raymond Hale is a charming young man, quite charming indeed. He works in the city, something to do with investments and property. Sylvia is utterly besotted with him. The pause that followed. Miss Marple had heard such pauses before in the voice of Mrs. Bantry, when discussing her nephew's unsuitable attachment to an actress, or in the careful silences of Colonel Melchett, when asked about his son's business ventures. You have reservations, Miss Marple observed gently. Lady Wickham set down her teacup with a sharp click. I have nothing concrete upon which to base any objection. He's well-mannered, well-dressed, attentive to Sylvia, and yet there is something about him that troubles me. A certain smoothness, perhaps charm without substance. She caught herself, as though aware she had revealed more than intended. But that is neither here nor there. The young man could not possibly have taken the brooch. He left immediately after dinner, well before I retired. Miss Marple made a small, non-committal sound. In her experience, the words could not possibly often preceded the discovery that someone most certainly could. Perhaps, she suggested, I might see the room where the brooch was kept. Lady Wickham rang for Graves, who appeared with the promptness of one who had been hovering nearby. He was instructed to show Miss Marple to her ladyship's bedroom, and Miss Marple followed his measured tread up the broad staircase, noting as she went the same subtle signs of economizing she had observed below fewer servants than a house of this size would once have employed. She suspected. The banisters gleamed, but there was dust in thickeners of the picture frames. Lady Wickham's bedroom was large and well-appointed, dominated by a 4-poster bed hung with faded brocade. The dressing table stood between 2 tall windows, its surface orderly and precise as silver-backed brush and mirror of fusemal boxes. A crystal vase that had recently held flowers. The vase, Miss Marple said. It was knocked over, I understand. Graves permitted himself the smallest of frowns. Indeed, Miss Marple. Clara found it broken on the floor yesterday morning. She was quite distressed about it. And where is the maid now? In the servants' hall, I believe. She's been rather upset since the discovery of the theft. Miss Marple approached the dressing table with the careful attention of one examining a piece of fine needlework. The drawer was perhaps 18 inches wide, with a small brass lock of the sort that could be found on any number of old pieces of furniture. She did not touch it, but bent slightly to observe it from different angles. There were no signs of forced entry. She asked, "None whatsoever, Miss Marple. The lock is quite undamaged, and the window latched from the inside, as it always is. Lady Wickham is particular about such matters." Miss Marple moved to examine the window. The latch was indeed secure, and when she peered out at the ground below, she saw precisely what she had expected to see. Nothing. No scuffed earth, no footprints in the flower bed, no convenient ladder left leaning against the wall. The gravel path that ran beneath the window was undisturbed, save for a few scattered shards of glass, presumably from the broken vase. She turned back to the room, her eyes travelling slowly across every surface. It was then that she noticed something small and white caught in the gap between two floorboards near the dressing table. She bent down with some effort and retrieved it carefully between thumb and forefinger. It was a fragment of ivory, curved and delicate, no longer than her little fingernail. Part of a comb tooth, she thought, or perhaps a hair ornament. She held it up to the light from the window. Does Lady Wickham wear ivory combs? Graves considered this with the gravity he might have applied to matters of international diplomacy. Her ladyship's combs are tortoiseshell, Miss Marple. Miss Sylvia, however, does possess an ivory setter gift from her late mother. Miss Marple placed the fragment carefully in her handkerchief and tucked it into her handbag. How interesting. And you say the vase of flowers was broken. Lilies, Miss Marple. White lilies. They were quite spoiled by the fall, of course. Jennings disposed of them yesterday morning, I see. Miss Marple gazed once more at the dressing table, her mind working through the sequence of events as they had been presented to her. A locked drawer, an undamaged lock, a key that never left its keeper's bosh, and yet the brooch had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. She thought suddenly of the affair of Mrs. Ellsworth's diamond ring, which had disappeared from a locked safe in the vicar's study during a committee meeting. Everyone had been quite certain it was burglary until Miss Marple had gently pointed out that Thevakar's cat had a habit of batting small objects through the grating in the floor. The ring had been found eventually lodged in the cellar beneath them. Mrs. Ellsworth had been terribly embarrassed, but there was no cat here, and the circumstances were rather different. A brooch did not simply fall through floors or slip down drains. Someone had taken it with purpose and planning. Tell me. Graves, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, what time does the household typically retire for the night? The staff are generally finished with their duties by 10, Miss Marple. Lady Wickham retires at 10 o'clock, as she mentioned. Miss Sylvia keeps somewhat later hours, though she is always in her room by 11. And on Wednesday evening, did any of you observe anything unusual? Any sounds? Any movements in the corridors? Graves hesitated, and in that hesitation, Miss Marple recognized the peculiar loyalty of a servant who did not wish to cast aspersions, but was also troubled by what he knew. Andrew, the footman, mentioned that he thought he'd heard footsteps in the east corridor around 11. The east corridor leads past Lady Wickham's room, but he could not be certain, and he saw no one. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Footsteps in the night, a broken vase, a missing brooch, and a fragment of ivory where it shouldn't not be. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to present themselves, though the picture they would ultimately form remained tantalizingly unclear. I should very much like to speak with Clara, she said. If that might be arranged, of course, Miss Marple. If you would care to follow me. As they descended the stairs once more, Miss Marple reflected that theft like murder, was almost never as simple as it first appeared. There were always layers beneath layers, secrets hidden within secrets, and the truth often lay not in what was said, but in what was carefully left unspoken. Chapter 3. The Maid's Whispered. A servants' hall was a world into itself. As Miss Marple well knew from her own household's more modest arrangements, here, as in St. Mary Mead, there existed a hierarchy as rigid as any found in the drawing-rooms above stairs, with its own codes of conduct and channels of gossip. Mrs. Hotchkiss, the cook, presided over the long table with authority of one who controlled the most essential resource in any establishment. She was a stout woman with flour permanently dusted into the creases of her apron, and she regarded Miss Marple's entrance with the barely concealed suspicion that all cooks seemed to harbour toward unexpected visitors. Clara, the lady's maid, sat at the far end of the table with a cup of tea growing cold before her. She was younger than Miss Marple had anticipated, perhaps 30, with a kind of pale, anxious face that suggested a temperament ill-suited to the demands of her position. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her hands twisted a handkerchief into increasingly tortured shapes. Clara, Graves said with gentle formality, "This is Miss Marple. Lady Wickham has asked her to look into the unfortunate matter of the brooch. She would like to speak with you." The effect of these words was immediate and alarming. Clara's face went from pale to ashen, and she half rose from her seat as though contemplating flight. Miss Marple moved forward quickly, her voice soft and, "My dear, there is no need for distress. I merely hoped you might help me understand what happened. Lady Wickham speaks very highly of your service." This last statement was something of an embellishment, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that a small Kinderskald unlocked doors that interrogation only bolted more firmly. Clara sank back into her chair, though her agitation remained palpable. "I didn't take it, miss," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear on my mother's grave, I never touched that brooch except to put it in its case and lock the drawer just as I always do." "I am quite sure you did not," Miss Marple, settling herself into the chair beside Clara with the air of one prepared for a comfortable chat. "But you must have been very shocked when you discovered it missing." "Shocked isn't the word for it, miss. I thought I should faint dead away. The drawer was locked, you see, just as I had left it. The key never left my neck." She touched the chain at her throat instinctively, as though reassuring herself it was still there when her ladyship asked me to fetch the brooch in the morning too. Show to the jeweller about the clasp that needed mending. The case was empty. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "You locketh drawer after Lady Wickham retired at 10 o'clock. "Yes, miss, just as always. I helped her ladyship prepare for bed, sorted her things, locked away the brooch, and then went down to finish pressing some linens before I retired myself. And you noticed nothing unusual in the room? Nothing out of place?" Clara's hands stilled their frantic twisting. "Well, there was the Vesta one with the lilies. It had been knocked over, and there was water all across the dressing table and down on the floor. I thought perhaps her ladyship had brushed against it in the night, though she's usually so careful." "When did you discover this?" "In the morning, miss, when I came to wake her ladyship at 8. The water had quite spoiled the wood finish, I'm afraid, and the flowers were ruined. I cleaned it all up straight away, but I was that worried about the damage to the table." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "You cleaned up the water and the flowers?" "Yes, miss. Gathered up all the broken glass and the lilies, and took them down to Jennings in the garden. He has a bin for such things." Clara's voice wavered again. "I should have mentioned it to her ladyship straight away, I suppose, but I was frightened. I broke a china figure in last month, you see, and her ladyship was quite stern about it. I thought if I told her about the vase, she might think me careless and, with the engagement party coming up." "You fear dismissal, Miss Marple," Sergeantly, remembering her own housemaid, Lucy, who had once concealed a chipped teacup for 3 days before confessing. "Yes, miss." Clara's eyes filled again. "And now with the brooch gone, it looks ever so bad for me, doesn't it? As though I made up the story about the vase to cover my own theft." "I think nothing of the sort," Miss Marple assured her. "Now, Clara, I want you to think very carefully. After you locked the drawer and went downstairs to finish your work, did you see anyone in the upstairs corridors, any of the other servants, or any of the family?" Clara frowned, concentrating. "Andrew was in the pantry polishing the silver. I heard him whistling as I passed. Mrs. Hodgkiss had already gone up to her room, and Graves was securing Theodore's for the night. Miss Sylvia was in the library, I believe. I saw a light beneath the door as I went by, and Mr. Hale, Lady Wickham mentioned he had been present for dinner." A slight colour rose in Clara's pale cheeks. "Mr. Hale had left before I went upstairs with her ladyship. Whoa," she hesitated, biting her lip. "Yes," Miss Marple encouraged. "It may be nothing, miss, but earlier in the evening, around 9, I saw Mr. Hale coming from the direction of her ladyship's room. He said he'd gone to fetch a letter that Lady Wickham had promised him, something to do with an introduction to a business associate. He was quite pleasant about it, but I did think it odd him going up to her private chambers without anyone to accompany him." Miss Marple filed this information away with the care of one sorting threads for a particularly complex piece of embroidery. In her experience, gentlemen did not wander unescorted into ladies' bedrooms, not even to fetch letters unless there was something more etto than matter than met the eye, rather like young Dr. Stone, who had claimed Tobe returning a medical book to Colonel Bantry's study, but had actually been attempting to retrieve his own rather indiscreet note to the Colonel's daughter. "And did you mention this to anyone?" "No, miss. I didn't think it was my place, and as I said, Mr. Hale was quite pleasant about it. He even made a joke about the house being a terrible maze, and how he had nearly ended up in the linen closet." "I see." Miss Marple rose from her chair, patting Clara's shoulder with a touch that was both comforting and dismissive. "You've been very helpful, my dear. Try not to worry. I am quite certain the truth will emerge, and when it does, I suspect you will find yourself entirely vindicated." As Graves escorted her back through the house, Miss Marple's mind was already weaving together the various strands: often formation, a broken vase, a fiancé wandering corridors where he had no beautiness, being a maid frightened of dismissal, and an ivory fragment that suggested Sylvia had also been in her grandmother's room at some point during the fateful evening. The truth, as always, was beginning to reveal itself in the small, seemingly insignificant details that others overlooked. And Miss Marple, with the patience born of years spent observing human nature in all its complexity, was prepared to follow each thread wherever it might lead. Chapter 4. Tea with Lady Wickham. Lady Wickham had retired to the conservatory by the time Miss Marple returned from the servants' hall. It was a handsome room, all glass and wrought iron, filled with the warm, earthy scent of potted palms and the more delicate fragrance of hothouse roses. Her ladyship sat in a wicker chair near the windows, gazing out over the gardens with an expression that struck Miss Marple as curiously absent-eyed, though she were looking at something far beyond the carefully tended lawns. "Ah, Miss Marple," she said, rousing herself as Graves announced the visitor. "I trust Clara was forthcoming. The girl has been quite beside herself since yesterday morning." "She was most helpful," Miss Marple replied, accepting the seat that was offered her, "though I fear she was labouring under the weight of considerable anxiety. Guilt, more likely," Lady Wickham said with a sharpness that seemed almost reflexive. "The servants are all thieves or fools, Miss Marple. I have learned this through long and bitter experience. One extends them every courtesy provides. Them with excellent positions, and what does one receive in return? Carelessness and dishonesty." It was a pronouncement delivered with the certainty of one who had never questioned her own judgments, and Miss Marple recognized in it the voice of her old acquaintance, Mrs. Price Ridley, who had accused 3 separate housemaids of theft, before discovering that her own cat had been hiding her jewellery behind cushions of the drawing-room sofa. "I wonder," Miss Marple said mildly, "whether you might tell me more of Booth evening itself, dinner party, I mean. You mentioned the vicar and his wife were present." Lady Wickham's expression softened fractionally. "Dr. Clement and his wife, yes, dear friends of many years, and Haydock, or local physician. He has attended the family since my late husband's time. They're all perfectly above suspicion, naturally." "Naturally," Miss Marple agreed, "and Mr. Halliot granddaughter's fiancé de temperaturing the conservatory seemed to drop several degrees." Lady Wickham's hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, now gripped the arms of her chair with sufficient force to whiten her knuckles. "Raymond Hale," she said, pronouncing each syllable with precision, "is a man of considerable charm." "Considerable charm, indeed. He converses well, dresses impeccably, and has managed to make himself quite indispensable to my granddaughter. But," Miss Marple prompted gently. Lady Wickham turned to look at her directly, and, in that moment, the careful facade slipped just enough to reveal something raw beneath. "But charm is not character, Miss Marple. I have lived long enough to know the difference. Mr. Hale is all polish and no substance. He works in the city, as I mentioned, though I confess I have never entirely understood what it is he does to do with finding investment opportunities for wealthy clients. He speaks of it vaguely, always vaguely." Miss Marple nodded with the understanding of one who had known several such gentlemen in her time. Young Mr. Pritchard from the village had been much the same, full of grand schemes and impressive talk. Right up until he had absconded to South America with £300 that belonged to the Church Restoration Fund. Sylvia met him in London during her season, Lady Wickham continued, her voice tight. "She was staying with my sister, and he was introduced at some party or other. Within a month she could speak of nothing else. Within 3 months they were engaged." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something approaching a whisper. "I tried to dissuade her. I suggested a longer acquaintance, urged her to consider whether she truly knew his character. She refused to listen." "Young people never do." "And Mr. Hale's family?" Miss Marple inquired. "You have met them?" "There is no family to speak of. His parents are both deceased, he claims. No siblings, nor relations of any significance. He is quite alone in the world." Lady Wickhamstone suggested this was not a circumstance that inspired sympathy, but rather suspicion. "Convenient, is it not? No inconvenient relatives to ask difficult questions or contradict his stories." Graves appeared then with a fresh tea tray, and the conversation paused while cups were filled and small cakes offered. Miss Marple accepted hers with thanks. "Nottingus," She did so that Lady Wickham's hand trembled as she poured from the silver teapot. It was a fine tremor, barely noticeable, but unmistakable nonetheless. "Are you quite well, Lady Wickham?" she asked. "Perfectly well," Camithi's sharp reply. "Merely distressed by recent events. One does not expect to be robbed in one's own home, particularly when the object taken is of such enormous significance. The brooch was very valuable, I understand." "Valuable." Lady Wickham set down the teapot with a force that rattled the cups. "It is worth more than this house, Miss Marple, more than this house and everything in it. The Wickham emerald is not merely a piece of jewelry. It is history, legacy, very embodiment of our family's standing. For 5 generations, it has passed from mother to daughter, an unbroken chain of inheritance." The vehemence in her voice was startling, and Miss Marple recognized in it something she had encountered before Rian, the prideful pronouncements of those whose circumstances had diminished, but whose sense of consequence had not. Mrs. Bantry's cousin had spoken just so about a worthless title that carried no state, and Miss Hartnell about ancestors who had fought at Agincourt as though historical glory could somehow compensate for present poverty. "And you intended to pass it to Sylvia?" Miss Marple ventured. I do." Lady Wickham's voice wavered between past and present tense in a way that struck Miss Marple as significant. "It's hold. Go to her on her wedding day as it came to me on mine. But the brooch must remain with true Wickham blood, with someone who understands its value and will preserve it for future generations, not someone who might see it merely as something to be sold or pawned at their first sign of financial difficulty." The implication was clear, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for young Sylvia, caught between her grandmother's pride and her own heart's inclinations, rather like poor Lucy Islesbarrow, who'd been forbidden to marry the curate because her mother deemed him insufficiently prosperous, despite the fact that the girl clearly adored him. "Did you show the brooch to your guests during dinner?" Miss Marple asked, steering the conversation back to more concrete matters. "After dinner, yes. We took coffee in the drawing room, and I brought down the case to show them. They all admired it greatly. Dr. Clementer remarked on the quality of the setting, and his wife commented on how beautifully it complemented the Wick emerald eyes." She smiled thinly, a family trait, the green eyes. "Sylvia has them, as did I, in my youth, though they fade with age, as all beauty does." "And Mr. Hale, what was his reaction?" Lady Wickham's expression hardened. "He examined it with what I can only describe as calculating interest, not the appreciation of beauty. You understand, but the assessment of value. I saw him turn it over in his hands, studying the setting, the clasp, the weight of it, like a pawnbroker appraising goods." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "And after this display, you returned the brooch to your room?" "Yes. I took it upstairs myself when I retired at 10 o'clock. Clara was waiting to help me prepare for bed, and she locked it in the drawer, as she always does. By morning, it was gone." Lady Wickham's voice broke slightly on the final word. "Everything I built, everything I preserved, stolen by some servant too base to appreciate what they had taken." But Miss Marple was not entirely convinced that the thief had been a servant, nor indeed that the theft, in its usual sense, had occurred out. There was something in Lady Wickham's manner, in the tremor of her hands, and the desperation beneath her ranger, that suggested a story more complicated than simple burglary. "Tell me," she said carefully, "did anyone besides your dinner guests know you intended to show the brooch that—" Lady Wickham frowned. "The household staff knew too. I had mentioned to Clara that I wished to display it, and Sylvia knew, of course." She had expressed a wish to wear it at the engagement party. Her mouth tightened, though I had not yet decided whether to permit that. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the conservatory floor. Miss Marple rose from her chair, gathering her handbag and gloves. "You've been most kind to speak with me so frankly, Lady Wickham. I wonder whether I might impose upon your hospitality a little longer. There, Arione or 2 other members of the household I should like to interview. If you have no objection, interview whomever you wish." Lady Wickham said wearily, "Though I fear you will find them all either guilty or useless. Perhaps both." As Miss Marple made her way back through the house, she reflected that Lady Wickham's bitterness, while understandable, was clouding her judgment considerably. The truth, when it emerged, would likely prove far more painful than the loss of any brooch, no matter how valuable. Chapter 5. The Footman's Alibi. Andrew, the young footman, was discovered polishing silver in the butler's pantry, a task he appeared to be approaching with more nervousness than skill. He was perhaps 22 or 23, with a kind of eager, open face that suggested a nature ill-suited to deception. When Graves announced Miss Marple's presence, the young man nearly dropped its sauceboat he had been buffing, catching it at the last moment with a fumbling motion that made his anxiety plain. "Andrew," Graves said, with the patient firmness of one accustomed to managing inexperienced staff, "Miss Marple wishes to ask you some questions about Wednesday evening." The footman's face, already pale, took a decidedly greenish tinge. "I didn't take nothing, I swear it on my life." Miss Marple settled herself on a nearby stool with the air of one preparing for an agreeable chat. "I am quite sure you did not, Andrew, but you may have seen or heard something that could help us understand what happened. Now, Lady Wickham retired at 10 o'clock. I believe, yes, Miss just, as always, very particular about her routine. Her lady is Anne. Where were you at that time?" Andrew's relief at this straightforward question was palpable. "Here, Mr. Right here in the pantry, finishing the silver for the dinner service. There's always a quantity of it to be done after a dinner party, and Mr. Graves is very strict about having it completed before we retire." "I see. And you remained here throughout the evening?" "Yes, me sent till gone 11, when I finally finished and went up tummy room." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "You must have been quite tired. Did you see anyone else during that time? Any of the other servants? Or perhaps one of the family?" The footman's expression became uncertain. "Well, I saw Clara pass by around 10 carrying some linens, and I heard Mrs. Hodgkiss upstairs going to her room. Mr. Graves was checking the doors and windows as he does every night, and no one else." Andrew hesitated, his finger still absently polishing the same spot on the silver. "Well, there was one thing, Miss Burt, I don't like to speak of, it not wanting to cause trouble where there might be none. I assure you, Andrew, anything you tell will be treated with the utmost discretion." The young man set down the sauceboat and rubbed his hands nervously on his apron. "It's just that Betty, one of the housemaids, she mentioned to me the next morning that she'd seen me coming from the east corridor around 11. The east corridor, miss, that's where her ladyship's rooms are. But I wasn't there. I swear it. I was here the whole time, more nearly so." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Nearly so. Well, I did step out for a moment to fetch more polish from the supply cupboard in the hall, but that's not near the east corridor, Miss. It's quite the other direction entirely, I see. And this housemaid, Betty, she was certain of what she saw. She said she saw Simeon in livery going up the stairs toward the east wing, but it couldn't have been me. Miss Marple rose from her stool and approached the young man with the careful attention of one examining a particularly interesting specimen. "May I see your cuffs, Andrew?" The request clearly startled him, but he extended his arms obediently. Miss Marple bent close, her sharp eye staking in every detail of the dark fabric. There, just visible on the left cuff, was a faint shimmer of green, barely perceptible in the lamplight, but unmistakable once noticed. "How curious," she murmured. "Tell me, Andrew, what sort of candles does the household use?" The abrupt change of subject seemed to confuse him. "Different sorts for different rooms, Miss. Plain tallow in servants' quarters. Beeswax for the family rooms, and the drawing room has special candles green tinted. Ones that her ladyship particularly favours. Very expensive they are. And when are Vesser candles changed?" "Every evening, Miss, as part of the nightly rounds. I help Mr. Graves with the triplacing any that have burned down and lighting fresh ones for the evening." "At what time does this occur?" "Around 11, Miss, after the family has." "But while there's still activity in the house." Miss Marple straightened, her mind working through implications with the precision of one completing a mathematical proof. If Andrew had been handling the green-tinted candles around 11, then he had indeed been in the drawing-room at precisely the time when the housemaid claimed to have seen someone in the east corridor. The wax on his cuff was evidence not of his presence at the scene of the crime, but of his adherence to his ordinary duties. "You changed the candles in the drawing-room on Wednesday night?" she asked. "Yes, Miss, same assaways. Mr. Graves supervised, as he always does for the family rooms, and the time was definitely around 11, perhaps a few minutes past, Miss. We just finished when the hall clock struck the quarter hour." Miss Marple returned to her seat, considering this new information carefully. If Andrew had been in the drawing-room with Graves at 11:15, then either the housemaid was mistaken about the time or she had seen someone else entirely. The latter possibility was more intriguing, suggesting that someone had deliberately dressed in livery to move about the house unobserved, that there had been two separate visits to the east corridor that evening. "Tell me about Betty, the housemaid who saw this person. Is she generally reliable?" Andrew's expression suggested uncomfortable loyalty wrestling with honesty. "She's a good worker, Miss, though perhaps a bit given to dramatics always, first with the gossip, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple took his meaning perfectly well. In her experience, those who were first with gossip were often last with accuracy, embroidering their stories to enhance their own importance in the telling, rather like Miss Weatherby from Thevely, who had claimed to witness 3 separate robberies that had turned out to be nothing more than neighbours returning borrowed items after dark. "One more question, Andrew. On Wednesday evening, did you notice anything unusual? Any sounds from upstairs? Any The young man frowned in concentration. "Nothing particular, Miss, though I did hear what might have been something falling round tin or thereabouts. A thump like, but old houses make all manner of noises, and I didn't think much of it at the time. A thump. The vase, Miss Marple thought knocked over and broken, but by whom and in what circumstances?" The timeline was becoming clearer, though the picture it revealed remained frustratingly inspill. She thanked Andrew for his time and allowed Graves to escort her back to the entrance hall. The afternoon had grown late, and the house had taken on that peculiar quality of stillness that comes when daylight begins to fail. And evening has not yet fully arrived. Assess prepared to depart. Miss Marple reflected that the theft of the Wickham emerald was proving to be considerably complex than a simple case of servant dishonesty. There were too many people moving about the house at suspicious hours, too many small inconsistencies in the accounts, and altogether too much that remained carefully unspoken. The truth was there waiting to be uncovered, but it would require patience and careful attention to detail. Fortunately, Miss Marple possessed both in abundance. Chapter 6. The Locked Dressing Table. Miss Marple returned to Wickham Manor the following morning, arriving just as the household was completing its breakfast rituals. Graves received her with the same impeccable courtesy he had shown the day, though she detected in his manner a certain wariness that suggested the strain of recent events was taking its toll on the entire establishment. Lady Wickham is not yet receiving visitors, Miss Marple, he informed her. She passed a difficult night, I understand, and has requested that Chanot be disturbed before noon. I quite understand, Miss Marple replied. In truth, I had hoped to examine Lady Wickham's dressing table more thoroughly if that might be permitted. There are ascertained details I should like to investigate more closely. Graves inclined his head. I shall inquire if you would care to wait in the morning room. The morning room was smaller and less formal than the drawing room, with comfortable chairs and windows that overlooked the rose garden. Miss Marple had barely settled herself when Sylvie appeared in the doorways in her morning dress, her hair loosely pinned, and her face bearing the unmistakable signs of recent tears. Miss Marple, she said, her voice uncertain. Graves mentioned you had returned. Have they discovered anything about the brooch? I mean. I am making progress, Miss Marple said carefully. These matters require patience and attention to details. Won't you sit down, my dear? You look quite exhausted. Sylvia sank into a chair with the graceless collapse of one too weary to maintain proper posture. I have not slept properly since it happened. Grandmother barely speaks to me. The servants whisper and fall silent when I pass. Raymond has been so terribly worried about the entire affair. He insists that the theft will cast a shadow over our engagement. Party that people will talk. And what do you think? Miss Marple asked gently. Vegel's eyes filled with tears. I think that a brooch, however valuable, should not matter more than people's happiness. But grandmother does not see it that way. To her, the Wickham emerald represents everything, our history or position, our very identity as a family. She has said a dozen times that it must remain with true Wickham. Blood that it cannot be entrusted to anyone who does not understand its significance. Miss Marple heard in this the echo of Lady Wickham's own words. From the previous day, your grandmother has reservations about your marriage, she observed. Sylvia's laugh was bitter. Reservations. She despises Raymond, though she cloaks it in polite language. She thinks him a fortune, hunter and suitable beneath our station. But she does not know him as I do. He is kind and attentive and amusing, and he makes me feel alive in a way that this house, with all its history and pride, never has. It was a passionate declaration, delivered with the absolute conviction of youth and misery. Miss Marple recognized in it the same fervent certainty she had had from countless young women over the years, some of whom had been proved right in their judgments, and so tragically wrong. Time alone would reveal which category Sylvia would fall into. Did you visit your grandmother's room on Wednesday evening? Miss Marple asked, keeping her tone conversational. The effect was immediate. Sylvia's face flushed, and her hands gripped the arms of her chair. Yes, I did. After she had retired, I went to speak with her about Raymond too, beg her to reconsider her opposition to our marriage. We argued. She was cruel, saying terrible things about him, about my judgment, about my duty to the family. The tears were flowing freely now. I left in such distress that I dropped my comb on the floor. I only realized it was missing later, and I was too frightened to go back for it. Miss Marple drew the ivory fragment from her handbag and held it up to the light. Part of it broke, I think. Sylvia's hand went to her mouth. Yes, it must have fallen against the leg of the dressing table. It was my mother's comb, one off. Few things I have from her. Is it very damaged? Only this small piece broke away, Miss Marple assured her. Now, my dear, I need you to tell me exactly what time you visited your grandmother's room, and precisely what occurred. Sylvia drew a shaking breath. It was shortly after I had been in the library, working myself up to the courage to confront her. I knew she would be angry, but I could not bear to see Raymond suffer under her disapproval any longer. I knocked, and she bade me enter. We spoke, or rather, we argued. She was sitting at her dressing table when I arrived. Then the brooch was there in its case on the table. She gestured to it while she spoke, saying that it would never grace the throat of anyone, not worthy of the Wickham name. And then I became quite upset. I moved toward her, pleading with her to understand, and my hand struck the vase of lilies. It fell and broke water everywhere. Grandmother was furious, not about the argument, but about the mess. She ordered me from the room and I fled. In my haste, I did not notice that my comb had fallen. Miss Marple considered this account carefully. The brooch was still on the dressing table when you left. Yes, in its case quite visible. I remember grandmother clutching it though I might try to seize it. And did you see anyone else in the corridor show? You returned to your room. Sylvia shook her head. No one. The house was quite silent. Graves appeared then to inform Miss Marple that she was welcome to examine Lady Wickham's room. Sylvia excused herself, clearly relieved to escape further questioning, and Miss Marple followed the butler up the familiar staircase to the bedroom. She had visited the previous day in the clearer light of morning. The room revealed details she had not fully appreciated before. The dressing table was an exquisite piece mahogany, with delicate inlay work and brass fittings that spoke of fine craftsmanship from an earlier age. Miss Marple examined it with the thoroughness of one who understood that furniture often held secrets its makers had intended. The drawer that had held the brooch was perhaps 15 inches deep. With the lock positioned in the center of the front panel, Miss Marple opened it carefully, noting that the mechanism moved smoothly despite its age. Inside, the drawer was lined with faded velvet, and at the back she could see the faint outline where the jewel case had rested. She ran her fingers along the interior surfaces, feeling for any irregularity in a hidden catch or spring that might indicate a false bottom or concealed compartment. It was as she explored the carved trim along the drawer's upper edge that she found it second keyholes, smaller than the first, and cunningly worked into the decorative pattern so as to be nearly invisibleness. One knew where to look. How very interesting, she murmured. Miss Marple Graves had remained near the dormant, the proper distance of a servant who was none the less curious about the investigation. This dressing table has a hidden compartment, Miss Marple explained. See, disguised beneath trimmer, second lock quite separate from the main drawer. Very clever work. I confess I was not aware of it, Graves said. Nor, I suspect, was her ladyship. But Miss Marple was not entirely convinced of that. The hidden compartment would have been ideal for fostering private correspondence documents one wished to keep from prying eyes. She tried the small keyhole with a head, working it gently until she felt something give. A narrow drawnum more than 2 inches deep slid forward. Inside lay a folded letter, the paper fine, but slightly yellowed with handling. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully and read the contents with understanding. My dearest Lady Wickham, greater than I must beg your indulgence for just 1 more month before we make the announcement formal. There are greater than certain business matters I must resolve, first arrangements that will ensure I can provide for Sylvia in the manner she greater than deserves. I trust you will understand the necessity of discretion in these matters, greater than your devoted future grandson. Raymond Hale. Miss Marple refolded the letter thoughtfully. So, Mr. Hale had visited Lady Wickham's room to retrieve this note, just as Clara had reported. But what business matter required such secrecy? And why would a man of supposed means need additional time to arrange his finances before an engagement announcement? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, was that Mr. Raymond Hale's circumstances were not quite what he had represented them to be, and Lady Wickham, for all her pride, had known or suspected as much. Chapter 7. The Broken Commiss had taken her luncheon at the village, in a modest establishment that nonetheless provided an excellent mutton pie and an even more excellent vantage point for observation. The inn's proprietress, Mrs. Dawson, was a woman of considerable insight into local affairs, and over the course of their conversation, Miss Marple had learned several illuminating facts about the Wickham household's recent economies, and Lady Wickham's increasing reliance in the goodwill of tradesmen who were owed rather more than was entirely comfortable. It was with this knowledge, adding weight to her existing suspicions, that Miss Marple returned to the manor in the early afternoon. She found Sylvia in the rose garden, walking among the late-blooming flowers with the aimless quality of one seeking distraction from troubling thoughts. Miss Marple, the girl said, her surprise evident. I had not expected to see you again so soon. I hope I am not intruding, my dear. I found myself with a few more questions, if you can spare me a moment of your time. Sylvia gestured toward a bench beneath an arbor, and they settled themselves among the fading roses. The afternoon sun was warm, but there was an autumnal quality to the light that suggested winter was not far distant. You mentioned yesterday that you dropped your comb during your visit to your grandmother's room. Miss Marple began. It was an ivory comb, I believe part of a set that had belonged to your mother. Yes, Sylvia said softly. My mother died when I was quite young. The combs area among the few personal items I have to remember her by. Miss Marple drew the ivory fragment from her handbag once more, but this time she also produced the comb itself, which she had retrieved from Sylvia's room with the assistance of Clara that morning. The piece fitted perfectly into the gap where a tooth had broken away. Your comb can be repaired, Miss Marple said gently. A skilled craftsman should be able to make it nearly as good as new, but I am curious about the manner in which it broke. You said it fell when you fled your grandmother's room. Yes, I was quite distraught. You understand, and in my haste I must have struck it against the furniture. I only realized it was missing when I reached my own room, and by then I was too frightened and upset to return. You were frightened of your grandmother's anger. I was frightened of everything, Sylvia said, her voice breaking. Of her de Saint-Preval losing Raymond and of the terrible things she had said. She told them that if I married him, I would be cut off entirely, that the brooch would never pass to me, that I would be dead to the family. Can you imagine hearing such words from your own grandmother? Miss Marple could imagine it quite clearly, having witnessed similar scenes played out in drawing rooms and parlours across England, where pride and prejudice clashed with youthful determination, and rarely on either side. Your grandmother was holding the brooch when you argued, she asked, not holding it precisely. It was in its case on the dressing table, but she gestured to it repeatedly, as though it were a weapon she wielded against me. This belongs to the Wickhams, she said, not to fortune hunters and adventurers masquerading as gentlemen. Sylvia's hands twisted in her lap. She was cruel, Miss Marple, deliberately cruel, and yet you love her still. The observation seemed to surprise Sylvia. I suppose I do, though I cannot think why. She has made my life miserable these past months, questioning Raymond's every word and action, casting doubt upon his character, treating me as though I were a foolish child incapable of judging my own heart. Tell me about Raymond, Miss Marple said. How did you meet? Sylvia's expression softened immediately, the transformation as complete as sunlight breaking through clouds. At a party in London, as grandmother mentioned, he was so different from the other men I had met, so attentive and interesting. He spoke of his work with such passion, his plans for the future, his desire to make something of himself. He made me feel as though I mattered, as though my thoughts and feelings were important. It was, Miss Marple reflected, precisely what any sensible young woman would wish to feel, and precisely what a clever fortune hunter would ensure she did feel. The question was which category Mr. Raymond Hale occupied. Has he pressed you to marry quickly? She asked. No, quite the opposite. He insists, Westhold, wait until grandmother comes, to accept him until everything is settled properly. He says he will not have a marriage begin under a cloud of family disapproval. Sylvia's voice held a note of pride. He is quite determined to win her over through patience and good character, or, Miss Marple thought tardily, until certain inconvenient financial matters could be resolved and questions about his circumstances could be safely obscured by the respectability of marriage into an established family. When you left your grandmother's room on Wednesday night, Miss Marple said, returning to more immediate matters, the brooch was still in its case on the dressing table. Yes, I am quite certain of it. Grandmother was still holding forth about family, honor, and bloodlines when I fled. The brooch was there, the case was opened, and everything was as it had been when I entered, except for the broken vase. And you saw no one in the corridors? No one, though I confess I was too upset to pay much attention. It might have passed an entire regiment without noticing. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I understand perfectly, my dear. Now there is one more thing I must ask. You, and I hope, will answer me honestly. Did you know about the hidden compartment in your grandmother's dressing table? Sylvia's eyes widened. Hidden compartment? No, I had no idea such a thing existed. What was in it? That, Miss Marple said, rising from the bench, is perhaps a question better addressed to your grandmother herself. Thank you for speaking with me so candidly, Sylvia. You've been most helpful. As she made her way back through the gardens toward the house, Miss Marple reflected on the various pieces of the puzzle that were slowly formed into a coherent picture. A proud woman facing financial ruin, a granddaughter desperate to marry against her wishes, a fiancé's circumstanced, deliberately vague, and a priceless heirloom that had vanished under circumstances that made less sense of more. One examined them. The truth, as always, lay not in the obvious conclusions, but in the small inconsistencies, the details that did not quite align, the stories that changed subtly with each telling. And Miss Marple, with her lifetime of observing human nature in all its complexity, was beginning to see the pattern that connected them all. Chapter 8. The Gardener's Secret. Miss Marple rose early the following morning, then was entirely comfortable for a woman of her years, but she had learned long ago that the best time to catch a gardener at his most forthcoming was in those first hours after dawn, when the day's work was just beginning, and the soil still held the dampness of night. Jennings was exactly where she had expected to find him, in the potting shed behind the greenhouse, preparing seedlings for the autumn planting. He was a man of perhaps 70, with withered face and gnarled hands that spoke of a lifetime spent coaxing beauty from the earth. When Miss Marple leaped in the doorway, he looked up from his work with the mild surprise of one unaccustomed to visitors at such an hour. "Morning, miss," he said, straightening with the careful slowness of one whose back had protested suck movements for some years now. "Bit early for a stroll in the gardens, isn't it?" "I confess I hoped to catch you before the day grew busy," Miss Marple replied. "I wonder if you might spare me a few. I understand you were the one who disposed of the broken vase from Lady Wickham's room." Jennings wiped his hands on his apron, a gesture that seemed more habit than necessity. "That I did. Clara brought down the pieces Thursday morning, all wrapped up in newspaper. Proper mess. It was glass everywhere, and the flowers quite spoiled. The lilies. Yes, white lilies. I believe that's right. Beautiful blooms. They were too. I'd cut them myself from the greenhouse only the day before. Shame to see them rusted." Miss Marple moved closer, her interest evident. "When you cleaned up the debris, did you notice anything unusual among the broken glass and flowers?" Jennings frowned, considering. "Unusual how, miss?" "Anything that did not belong, something that might have been on the dressing table when the vase fell." The old gardener's expression cleared. "Oh, there was a bit of green sparkle caught up in the stems. I thought it was just a piece of the vase at first, some coloured glass, but when I looked closer, it seemed different, like a stone of some sort, or maybe a button. I tossed it in the rubbish bin with the rest, didn't think much of it." "Might I see this rubbish bin?" Miss Marple asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested the request was rather more important than casual curiosity would warrant. Jennings led her to a corner off the potting shed, where several bins stood in various states of fullness. "This one here," he said, indicating a wooden barrel half filled with garden waste and household refuse. "Though I can't promise you'll find it, miss. Been to O'Day's now, and I've added considerable to it since." Miss Marple was not deterred by such obstacles. She had, over the years, searched through far worse in pursuit of truth, including Mrs. Bantry's compost heap when investigating the matter of the missing silver teaspoons. With Jennings's assistance, she carefully sorted through the contents of the bin, setting aside wilted flowers, vegetable peels, and various other detritus until her fingers closed on something small and hard. It was, as Jennings had described, a green stone roughly cutened, set in what appeared to be a small metal mounting. Not a button precisely, but something that might easily be mistaken for one. Miss Marple held it up to the light, streaming through Theashti's dusty window. "An imitation emerald," she said quietly. "Paste but reasonably well made." The sort of thing one might find on an inexpensive brooch or piece of costumery. Jennings peered at it with interest. You're saying that's not real, miss? I am quite certain it is not. A genuine emerald of this size would be worth a considerable sum, far too valuable to be carelessly embedded in a vase of flowers. Miss Marple wrapped the stone carefully in her handkerchief and placed it in her handbag. Tell me, Jennings, how long have you worked here at Wickham? Coming up on 40 years, miss. Started as under gardener when the old master was still alive, and worked my way up to head gardener after Roberts retired. Then you have seen the familiar through many changes, good times and difficult ones. Jennings's expression grew cautious, the weariness of a loyal servant who knew more than he was comfortable revealing. I have. The estate has faced financial difficulties in recent years, Miss Marple said gently. It was not a quest. The old gardener sighed. I suppose it's no secret, not really. To Master Lady Wickham's husband, he made some poor investments before he passed, lost a fair bit of the family fortune. Her ladyship has done her best to maintain appearances, but it's been hard on her. Very hard indeed. I imagine so. Pride is a heavy burden when circumstances change. That it is, Miss Sand. Her ladyship has always been a proud woman, not cruel. Mind you, but particular about standards and proper behaviour. She's had to let go several of staff over the years. The household expenses, though she's tried to keep it from being obvious to outsiders. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And the Wickham emerald. She would have been most reluctant to part with such a significant family heirloom. Jennings glanced around as though checking that they were truly alone. I shouldn't speak of it, miss, but since you seem to know already, there were rumours some years back. Talk among the staff that her ladyship had taken the brooch to London to a jeweller. When she returned, she was upset, shut herself in her room for 2 days. Mrs. Hotchkiss thought she'd been given bad news about the stone, maybe a flaw that reduced its value. Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, she had been exploring the possibility of selling it to cover debts. I couldn't say for certain, miss, but after that visit, her lady seemed to guard the brooch even more jealously than before, showed it off at every opportunity, as though proving to herself and everyone else that it was still in her possession. It was a picture that was become clear to Miss Marple, the portrait of a woman, trapped between pride and necessity, between the appearance of wealth and the reality of diminished circumstances, like Mrs. Carmichael from Thevelet, who had worn paste copies of her jewels for years, while the originals lay in a pawnbroker's vault, maintaining the fiction of prosperity until the day she died, and the truth emerged to the shock of all who had conned her. You have been most helpful, Jennings, Miss Marple said. I wonder if I might trouble you for one more small favour. I should like some of these white lily, the same variety that were in Lady Wickham's vase. Could you cut me a few stems? The request clearly puzzled him, but he complied readily in selecting 3 perfect blooms and wrapping their stems in damp cloth. As Miss Marple accepted them with thanks, she reflected that the puzzle was nearly complete now. Only a few pieces remained to be fitted into place, and then the truth would emerge in all its uncomfortable clarity. Her way back toward the house, the lilies in one hand and her handbag now containing the imitation emerald in the other. The morning sun was climbing higher, but away the last traces of mist from the lawns, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the church bells of the village calling Theft. Too early service it would be, she thought. A day of revelations, said not all of them would be welcome. Chapter 9. The Emerald. That wasn't the time Miss Marple returned to the Manor's drawing room. Lady Wickham had risen and dressed, though she appeared somehow as though the events of recent days had extracted a toll that no amount of careful grooming could duskwise. She stood by the window, one hand resting on the still gazing out at Degadens with an expression of profound weariness. Miss Marple, she said without turning. Graves informed me you've been making inquiries among my staff, and wandering my gardens at an unseemly hour. I trust you have a good reason for such irregular behaviour. I have an excellent reason, Miss Marple replied. I believe I know what happened to the Wickham emerald. Lady Wickhampton, sharply, hope and fear warring in her expression. You found it. You know who took it. I know where it is, Miss Marple said carefully. Though perhaps we should discuss the matter with your granddaughter, present, and Mr. Hale as well if he is available. Raymond is in the library, Lady Wickham said, her voice hardening at the mention of his name. As for Sylvia, I believe she's in her room, but I fail to see why they need be present for this discussion. I think you will understand presently, Miss Marple said with gentle firmness. Perhaps you might ask Graves to assemble everyone in the drawing room, the entire household, if possible. I find that these matters are best resolved when all parties hear the truth. Together, Lady Wickham's face had gone quite pale, but she rang for Graves and issued the necessary instructions. Within a quarter of an hour, the drawing room had filled with an odd assortment of people. Sylvia sat near her grandmother, her face anxious and confused. Raymond Hale stood by Theophilus Every Inch the prosperous gentleman in his well-cut suit, though Miss Marple noted a certain tension in his posture that suggested discomfort. The servants had gathered near the door, Clara wringing her hands, Andrew shifting nervously from foot to foot, and Mrs. Hodgkiss regarding their proceedings with the sceptical eye of one who had seen many dramas unfold in her years of service. Now then, Miss Marple began, settling herself in a chair with the air of one preparing to tell a rather long story. I have spent the past 2 days investigating the disappearance of the Wickham emerald, and I have reached certain conclusions that I believe will resolve this unfortunate matter. Then you know who stole it? Lady Wickham demanded. Which of these servants betrayed my trust? No servant stole the brooch, Miss Marple said firmly. Indeed, the brooch was never stolen at all. The silence that followed this pronouncement was absolute. Sylvia stared at Miss Marple in bewilderment. Raymond Hale's expression sharpened with interest, and Lady Wickham had gone very still indeed. I don't understand, Sylvia sighed. If it wasn't stolen, then where is it? Miss Marple drew the imitation emerald from her handbag and, wrapping it from its handkerchief with deliberate care. This stone was found among the broken lilies from your grandmother's vase. It is paste, rather. Good imitation, but paste nonetheless. It came from the brooch that was displayed to guests on Wednesday evening. That's impossible, Lady Wickham said, but her voice lacked conviction. The Wickham emerald is genuine. It has been appraised numerous times over the years. I have no doubt the original brooch was genuine, Miss Marple agreed. The thepes you have been displaying for the past several years is not the original. It is a replica commissioned at some point to replace the authentic brooch after it was sold. Lady Wickham sank into the nearest chair, pretense of dignity abandoned. Sylvia made a small stricken sound, and Raymond Hale took a step forward as though to speak, then thought better of it. You cannot prove such an accusation, Lady Wickham whispered. I can prove it quite easily, Miss Marple said, not unkindly. This loose stone is evidence enough, but I suspect a jeweller's examination would confirm it. The brooch broke during your argument with Sylvia on Wednesday night. When the vase fell and struck it, the paste stones came loose from there, settings revealing their true nature. You realized immediately what had happened, what would be exposed if anyone examined. The broken pieces, too closely so. You pretended it was stolen, Sylvia said slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. You claimed someone had taken it to hide the fact that it was a fake. Lady Wickham's hands covered her face. I had no choice, she said, her voice muffled. The debts after my husband died, the investments that failed, the creditors pressing for payment. Thimerald was all we had left of any real value. I sold it to save the estate, to keep this house, to maintain some semblance of our position. I had a replica made thinking no one would know that. I could preserve the familiar's reputation even as I sacrificed the reality behind it. How long ago did you sell it? Miss Marple asked gently. 5 years, perhaps 6. Time blurs when Onez living a lie. Lady Wickham lowered her hands. Her face was streaked with tears. I told myself it didn't matter, that the appearance was what counted, that no one need ever know. But then Sylvia Beckermingdan, the brooch should have been hers, passed down, as tradition demanded. How could I give her pastan, pretend it was the real thing? How could I admit what I had done? Raymond Hale cleared his throat. Lady Wickham, I must confess that I suspected something of this nature. The letter you received from me asking for a delay in the announcement, it was not truly about my business arrangements. I had taken the liberty of making discreet inquiries about Thiebruch, concerned that it might not be what you represented. I thought if we delayed I might find a way to resolve the matter quietly. You knew. Sylvia turned to him, astonishment plain on her face. I suspected, he amended. I have some experience with jewellery through my work, and certain aspects of the brooch troubled me, but I said nothing because I understood the impossible position your grandmother occupied. Lady Wickham laughed bitterly. So you are not the hunter I believed you to be. Mr. Hale, you're instead a man of considerably more perception than I gave you credit for. I suppose I owe you an apology. And I owe you one, Sylvia said, turning back to her grandmother. For all the terrible things I thought, for doubting you, for not understanding the burdens you carried alone. Miss Marple rose from her chair, sensing that the family needed privacy for what would come next. The brooch may be gone, she said quietly, but the family remains, and that, I think, is worth considerably more than any jewel, however valuable. Chapter 10. Truth in the Looking Glass. Drawing room had emptied off servants' graves, having shepherded them out with the tactful efficiency of one who understood when family matters required privacy. Only Miss Marple, Lady Wickham, Sylvia, and Raymond Halloramenda afternoon. Light slanting through the tall windows and casting long shadows across the Persian carpet. Lady Wickham sat very still in her chair, her hands folded in her lap with a composure that seemed hard-won. When Chat spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. I suppose you think me a terrible hypocrite, Miss Marple, using my servants of theft while concealing my own deception. I think you were a woman in an impossible situation, Miss Marple replied, though I confess the accusations against your staff troubled them considerably. Innocent people might have suffered for a crime that never occurred. They would have been cleared eventually, Lady Wickham said, but there was little conviction in her words. I never truly believed any of them guilty. I simply needed time to think of some solution, some way out of the trap I had created for myself. Sylvia knelt beside her grandmother, taking the older woman's hands in her own. Why did you not tell me about debts? About the sale of the brooch? I would have understood. I would have helped somehow. You were too young when it happened, barely 20, and later, when you were... How could I confess such a thing? The Wickham emerald, representing our family, stood for our history, our legacy. To admit I had sold it would have been to admit failure, to acknowledge that I could not preserve what had been entrusted to me. Lady Wickham's voice cracked slightly. Your grandfather made poor choices with his investments. Yes, but it was my responsibility to manage what remained, and I failed. You did not fail, Raymond Hale said, speaking for the first time since his earlier confession. You saved the estate, preserved the house, kept family together through difficult times. That the price was a piece of jewelry, however valuable, seems to me a small sacrifice compared to what you achieved. Lady Wickham regarded him with an expression that mixed surprise and reassessment. You are more generous than I deserve, Mr. Hale, particularly given that I have spent months questioning your character and motives, suspecting you of precisely the sort of mercenary calculation that I myself practiced. You are protecting Sylvia, he said simply. Any grandmother would do the same, though. I confess, I wish you had been less successful in delaying our engagement. These past months have been rather trying. Despite everything, a faint smile touched Sylvia's lips. You'd never told me you suspected about the brooch. How could I? You loved your grandmother, revered the family history. To cast doubt on the emerald would have hurt you, and I could not bear that. I thought if I could quietly verify the truth and perhaps find some way to resolve it, arrange for a new stone without anyone knowing, we might spare the pain of revelation. He glanced at Miss Marple. Though I see now that secrets have a way of emerging regardless of our efforts to contain them. Secrets almost always do, Miss Marple agreed. They are rather like weeds in a garden. I find one may cover them with pleasant landscaping, but eventually they push through to the surface. Lady Wickham drew a shaking breath. With the pans now, I suppose the entire village will know within days. The gossip, the scandal, everything I sought to avoid will come to pass regardless. That depends, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, on what you choose to do. The constable was never formally involved beyond an initial report, as no actual theft occurred. There is no crime to investigate. The servants know only what we choose to tell them, and they have no reason to suspect the full truth if we are discreet. You are suggesting we maintain the deception? Sylvia asked. I am suggesting, Miss Marple corrected gently, that you control the narrative rather than allowing circumstances to control you. The brooch was not stolen. It was damaged in an unfortunate descent when the vase fell during your visit to your grandmother's room. Upon examination, it was discovered that the stones had deteriorated over time, become fragile and were beyond repair. A sad loss, but not a scandal. The family has decided that the tradition of fastening the brooch to each new bride will end. With this generation, as the piece itself has ended. These things happen. Lady Wickham stared at her. You would help us conceal the truth. I would help you preserve your dignity while acknowledging reality, Miss Marple said. There is a difference between harmful deception and merciful discretion. What purpose would be served by exposing the full details of your financial difficulties to public scrutiny? You have suffered enough, I think, without adding public humiliation to your burdens. But the engagement party, Sylvia said. Everyone will expect to see the brooch will Want to hear the story of how it will pass to me? Then you must tell Thema version of the truth, Raymond said slowly. That the brooch was damaged beyond repair and that your grandmother decided to commission a new piece for you. Instead, something modern representative of a new generation rather than bound to the past. Lady Wickham closed her eyes. I cannot afford to commission anything of value. The debts are still considerable, though less desperate than they were 5 years. The sale of the emerald provided breathing room, but only just. Then, perhaps, Raymond said carefully, you might allow me to contribute to such a commission as a wedding gift. Note paste, not a false show but something genuine that Sylvia might truly wear with pride. I could not accept such a gift, Lady Wickham began, but Raymond held up a hand. Not as charity, Lady Wickham-Booter's family. When Sylvia and I marry, we become family. We'll become family. Will you approve entirely of the match or not? In families help one another, do they not? My circumstances are comfortable and I would consider it an honor to help establish a new tradition for the Wickham family, one built on honestier than appearance. For a long moment, Lady Wickham said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. You are a better man than I believed. Mr. Hale, I owe you a considerable apology for my harsh judgments. You owe me nothing except perhaps permission to marry your granddaughter without further delay, Hesed with a smile. Though I confess I would appreciate your blessing as well as your permission. Lady Wickham rose from her chair with visible effort and Sylvia rose with her, still holding her grandmother's hands. You have both my permission and my blessing, she said, and my profound gratitude for your generosity in the face of my own prejudice and pride. Miss Marple gathered her handbag and gloves, sensing that her presence was no longer required. As she moved toward the door, Lady Wickham called after her, Miss Marple, a moment, if you please. Miss Marple turned, waiting. You've unstitched my entire life, Lady Wickham sighed, her voice holding a note of something between accusation and wonder. Exposed every careful fabrication, revealed every hidden shame. I am not certain whether to thank you or curse you. I have only pressed out their creases, Miss Marple said gently. What was wrinkled and uncomfortable has been smoothed flat. What happens next is entirely your choice, but at least now you may proceed with honesty rather than continuing to carry the weight of deception. Then, you truly believe the village need not know the full truth. It believed the village need know only what serves a useful purpose. Truth without kindness is cruelty. Lady Wickham and have never been cruel for its own sake. As Miss Marple made her way through the entrance hall, Graves appeared with her coat and hat. The car is waiting to Takeo to the station, Miss Marple. I trust your investigation was successful. Quite successful. Thank you, Graves, though perhaps not in the way anyone expected. The best solutions rarely are, he said, and there was approval in his voice. The train journey back to St. Mary Mead passed in comfort. Miss Marple gazed out at the countryside rolling past, her knitting needles clicking in their familiar rhythm. Family pride, she reflected, was indeed the most expensive of all and the easiest to lose. But perhaps, with care and honesty, it might also be the easiest to restore. She thought of Lady Wickham freed at last from the burden of her secret handoff, Sylvia who would begin her marriage without the shadow of false legacy hanging over it. And she thought of Raymond Hale who had proved himself to be precisely the sort of man any grandmother should be grateful to welcome into her family. The truth, Miss Marple mused, was sometimes painful tunk-over, but it was infinitely preferable to the slow poison of sustained deception and, in the end, honesty proved far more valuable than any emerald, genuine or otherwise. As the train pulled into St. Mary Mead station, she tucked away her knitting and prepared to disembark, already looking forward to her own familiar cottage and garden. Some mysteries, she reflected with satisfaction, ended not with scandal, but with redemption.